Well, coming into this week, you did the Georgia Clemson game for ESPN in Atlanta in week 1. And those intro games are always interesting. I feel like they tell the truth more than they lie. But when you left that game, what did you come away thinking about Georgia?
Ooh, about Georgia, that they are more athletic than they've been in the past. And that's saying a lot because they've been super
Mm-hmm.
athletic. But if you think about Georgia, they've always been kind of just big and physical on the interior of the defensive line. And then they had a bunch of fast guys around them. Now they kind of have fast guys everywhere. So that was one question. I came away from it thinking, I don't know yet about their secondary.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because there were a couple times against Clemson where Clemson had receivers that got behind the DBs and they just, for whatever reason, couldn't connect. So I wasn't sure about that. I thought the offensive line was good. And I thought that they had explosive playmakers at running back for the first time in a while. Now, that's no disrespect to Dejon Edwards or to Kendall Milton, the guys they've had in recent years, but I feel like Nate Frazier was a different level of speed, had some like DeAndre Swift qualities where it's like, all right, their running back scares you to death now, which that hasn't been the case in a while. Felt like there's still a significant void at tight end as far as a game changer, because you're not going to have a Brock Bowers. But I thought that Lawson Lucky showed a little bit in that game in the pass catching that maybe he can fill that void while Delp does some more of the traditional Y stuff. And then Urosic can do that stuff as well. And that Carson Beck had a little bit of an off day that day. Like there were a couple rare misses for him where maybe threw it on the back hip. You know what? It's week 1. He'll clean those things up. So that was my initial impression with Georgia, that they're really, really good. They played probably their B- game in that game and still ran away from what I thought was a pretty good team. And then fast forward to them again against Kentucky and felt like, all right, now they're injured in a few spots, which is concerning. Kirby told us that they had lacked depth in the preseason, and you kind of see it, D-line, they kind of need to get healthy there. They're now without their right guard for a little while, and Tate Ratledge, that's going to be problematic potentially. The left tackle in Ernest Green was a little up and down to the point where he even got replaced against Kentucky. So I think maybe it's still a bit of a work in progress for them, but their ceiling's crazy high. It's just we haven't seen the best version of them just yet.
You've gone up against Kirby Smart's defenses in practice plenty of times throughout your career. But when you look at what he has done, and there'll be plenty of talk about this during the week, but when you look at what he's done away from Alabama, why do you think he has had so much more success leaving the Saban nest compared to some of the other guys that left the Alabama program that coached under Saban that didn't have the same kind of success?
It's a few different reasons. One, situation. That's big. I mean, with all due respect to Will Muschamp and Jim McElwain and Jeremy Pruitt, who made his own bed, and some of the others that have gone on after having spent time in the Saban tree. It's a lot about situation. I mean, a lot of these places you just can't win every year. Like you just can't. I mean, it's just, and that sounds terrible, but it's the reality. Like some places are going to ebb and flow. Historically speaking, you can tell the places that ebb and flow. And I do think while Mark Richt was an amazing person, what Kirby walked into was not a broken situation. It was a situation in which they had good, but they wanted great. And that, I think, is a very rare situation in which they rip off the Band-Aid on a really, really good coach, a Hall of Fame level head coach, and replace him with arguably the best coach of this younger generation of coach. That's very rare. People will also say, well, what about Lane Kiffin? Well, I think Lane Kiffin, having gone to FAU and then but he'd been a head coach at Tennessee, had been a head coach at USC, that's had some trial and error, what works, what doesn't. He now goes to FAU, kind of understands, all right, this is a place where I got to score a ton of points. The transfer portal becomes in vogue. He's a guy with professional background, having spent time in the NFL, so it's not uncomfortable for him to discuss dollars and cents with guys. So I think the timing of when he got to Ole Miss could not have been more perfect. I looked at at Steve Sarkisian, it's hard not to win at Texas, frankly. I mean, like,
What?
and Sark, I think when you have alignment, I mean, you got to have alignment, but in this day and age, Texas has deep pockets, great history, access to, I think, probably the best high school personnel from a like refinement standpoint in America. Mm-hmm. I think Texas high school football is probably the best. Do they have the best players? Not necessarily saying that, but I think just the level of coaching that players receive in Texas is at a level that's unlike that of most other places. So, I mean, he walks in and it's immediately ready to roll. And I think he did a great job of changing the culture, acknowledging it's not okay to lose. It's not okay to play a certain way. Like, we do things a certain way. And the era, having changed right underneath his feet, has now had them poised for great success. So I think a lot of it has to do with where you go. But I think Kirby is just, he's like Coach Saban in the sense that there is a never-ending hunger for greatness. And I think that he is only happy when he's unhappy. You know what I mean? Like, he is only happy when he's striving for what's next. Like, the so what's next mentality, I think, is really well exemplified with Kirby. And I think that's why he's had tremendous success. Like, he's not resting on his laurels. He's only hungry for more, and he'll do whatever it takes to get there.
You know, in terms of coaches buying into a guy, you know, the Kalen DeBoer, Jalen Milroe marriage was really interesting. He's not all that dissimilar from Michael Penix, but certainly not as refined as a passer, still a different skill set, certainly more of a runner. But it seems like Alabama has leaned into that, and Kalen DeBoer has used his skills. They haven't tried to force him to be something that he's not. When you're sitting there as a quarterback and you have a coach that is leaning into what you do well and is sort of, you know, showing that belief in you and not trying to force you to be something that you're not, where do you feel like that can show up on the field and having confidence in a guy and helping him, you know, become the best version of himself? What does that kind of mean to a quarterback?
Well, I think it means a lot. I mean, I think it's really hard. I mean, Tua Tagovailoa said it, 3 or 4 weeks ago, it became a big story. And
the Brian Flores thing,
about Brian
beating
Flores,
him down.
And, you know, and how does it feel to show up and you're told how bad you are every day? Like, that's hard on a guy. And you just think about how many guys, how many great players we've seen that lose their mojo. I mean, I think one of the best examples in the recent era is Spencer Rattler, a guy that completely lost his mojo at Oklahoma, gets beat out by Caleb Williams, was unrecognizably average his last year at Oklahoma, goes to South Carolina, you know, kind of average for about 10 games. And then boom, the Tennessee game happens. It's like, this is a different guy. Yeah. Now we're back to like the guy that we saw that was at one point one of the faces of college football, you know, but it took basically half a season when he was a backup and 10 games into his South Carolina tenure for him to get his mojo back. So I think it's really, really hard to play quarterback when you lack confidence. It's really, really hard. It's also really hard to play quarterback when you're constantly told don't screw it up. When you're constantly told, you know, hey, you can't make a mistake. Like, if you're playing not to make a mistake, you're going to make a mistake. Like, when I stand over a golf ball, and anyone that's ever played golf knows this, and I'm thinking, man, there's a bunker to the left and there's water to the right. And I'm thinking, I'd rather be in the bunker than the water. Don't hit it in the water. Guess where I hit it? The water.
Duck hook coming.
Yeah. So like, it's no matter what. So I think the brain is difficult thing to kind of figure out in quarterbacks, a position where your accuracy improves when you're confident, your arm strength improves when you're confident, because you can throw it without any hesitation whatsoever. And I think that Kalen, and just getting to know him in the time that he was at Washington and spending a little time around him since he's been at Alabama, he's one of those guys that just like overwhelmingly positive all the time. Like, you're the best, you can walk on water. And if you believe that, then you're going to play better. So I think that that's been beneficial, but I also think too, there has to take a willingness from the player to, for example, if you are a a runner like Jalen Milroe is. He's a great runner. Like him going and running quarterback lead sweep is not going to be great for his NFL prospects. Like NFL teams don't care about that. Like that's outside of the Baltimore Ravens. There's not a lot of teams that have that in the arsenal in the NFL. Okay, you see it some maybe with the Buffalo Bills, but there's not a lot. Not a lot of design quarterback runs. So a lot of guys are wanting to now be developed for the eventual move to the NFL. And there is a hesitation to do some of the things that might help your team win because that's not going to help your prospects as a player at the next level. So I think there has to be a willingness, and it seems like with Jalen there is, to do those things. And hey, these are my best skill set still is me on the perimeter with the ball in my hands. I think he acknowledges that, as opposed to trying to show everybody that he's a thrower, trying to show everybody he can win from a drop back passing game, and he can carve you up on the intermediates and underneaths. That's just not who he is, and that's okay. There's fine. You don't have to be that, especially if you're dynamic with the ball in your hands.
When you look at this matchup on Saturday, what decides it in your mind?
Matchup like this is always a big turnover. I hate to, but even back to the SEC championship game last year, the fumble there deep in their own end for Georgia. That really was a huge, huge factor in the game. Whether or not that, had it not happened, would Bama have still won? I don't know. But I know that there's always seemingly a turnover in this game or this matchup that seems to turn the game on its head. I think even 2021, when Bama beat Georgia in the SEC championship game, Stetson threw a pick low in his own end, and that turned the game on its head. I think Georgia had a lead at that point. I can't remember off the top of my head, but anyways, it's always seemingly an interception or a fumble that turns the game, to a completely different spot. But I also think the biggest thing is which secondary plays better. And that to me is a huge question in the game, because the big question mark coming into the season for Alabama is their youth in the secondary. And they're moving into a new philosophy with what they're doing with Kane Womack. A lot of zone defense, a lot of disguises, more vision-based defense, which is going to allow for more turnovers, but it's also going to allow the opposing quarterback a lot more easy completions. So I think they're going to have to tackle extremely well in space. They're going to have to really do a good job, because Georgia's got some great players with the ball in their hands that are awesome after the catch. So that secondary matchup against Georgia's wide receivers. And then on the other side, I think the biggest question mark for Georgia still at this point is their secondary. And that's not Malachi Starks. Malachi Starks is a monster. He's the best safety in America. But removing him, the other three guys, or four if you want to include the nickel, I think those guys are going to have a difficult matchup with these wide receivers. And I think that's a group that, as of this moment, has yet to really show me, all right, this is a group that's as good as they were a year ago. So obviously you lost some great players in Bullard, and you lost a great player in Lassiter, and they've replaced them with talented guys, but are they capable of locking you down in the passing game? That's what I'm curious about. So I think the question marks that both teams have in secondary is of significance, and that's one that I'll be watching very closely.